Hi everybody and welcome to the third video in our series of exploring the role of the state in the macroeconomy. Right, now what you have seen so far in this series of videos is a video on public expenditure. So looking over things such as the difference between capital and current expenditure, but also transfer payments. And then thinking about when we change the size and the composition of public expenditure, how it would impact on the economy. The second video was looking at taxes. So looking at the different types of taxes, such as progressive, regressive, proportional, direct, indirect taxes, and then looking at how changing these different taxes would impact on the economy. So hopefully, for example, you are now pretty comfortable with drawing and explaining the Laffer curve, understanding how taxes can impact on foreign direct investment and price levels across the economy. Now, what we're going to be doing in this video is putting all of this together by looking at public sector finances. So we're going to be looking at the public expenditure and the taxation together to look at the state of the government's finances. Right, so you've got some key terms that you need to be comfortable with. These top two we've done before in theme 2. Fiscal, or what we call budget deficits, and fiscal, or what we call budget surpluses. Now, what we should be happy with is that public expenditure is a cost for the government. It's government spending money on the economy. And that is your current and capital expenditure and your transfer payments. But tax revenue is an income for the government. So when they tax people through income tax or on VAT, that becomes an income for the government. So a fiscal deficit would be where the level of public expenditure exceeds the level of tax revenue coming into the government. And we normally measure this over a financial year. So if the level of public expenditure in that year exceeds the tax revenue, then it means that we're operating with a fiscal deficit. A fiscal surplus would be the opposite. This is where the level of tax revenue coming into the government is higher than what they're spending back through public expenditure. Now, the next one is something called national debt. And this is something that people often confuse with fiscal deficits. Now, the national debt is all the unpaid fiscal deficits. So it's that accumulation of all the unpaid fiscal deficits that are yet to be repaid. So what we know is roughly at the moment, the UK's national debt is approximately 100% of GDP. Well, that is because we've got lots of fiscal deficits in recent years that have been building up and are adding to the overall level of national debt. So whenever you operate with a fiscal deficit in a new year, that will be new borrowing that needs to take place that will then be added on to the national debt. Next key term is something we call automatic stabilizers, or what we call counter-cyclical responses to the business cycle. Now, if you think about what's happening here, we're in a positive output gap. We've got high GDP growth. We've got high levels of employment, and unemployment is really, really low. Generally, businesses are performing very, very well. There's high spending and high confidence in the economy. Now, in a positive output gap, there's a very good chance that automatically there will be a reduction in government spending. It doesn't need to be a new policy, it will automatically happen. And that is because in a positive output gap, there'll be less need for transfer payments. There'll be less need for unemployment benefits, for example, because unemployment is really, really low. There's also a good chance that in a positive output gap, there'll be lots of additional tax revenue coming into the government. With the reason being, if the economy is doing well, you've got more people working, that's more people paying income tax, but also more people earning more money, so paying higher rates of income tax. You've got more people spending, so you've got more VAT coming in, and businesses perform better, so you're going to have more corporate tax generated as well. So guys, in a boom, what we'd expect to see is government spending will automatically fall and taxation will automatically increase. In a recession, so in a negative output gap, we'd expect the opposite to happen. So in a negative output gap, you've got growing unemployment, falling incomes, less spending, firm struggle. Now, because of that, there'll be less taxation being paid to the government. Unemployed people, for example, will not be paying income tax. As incomes fall, people will pay less income tax. If people spend less in the economy, there's less VAT being paid, And if businesses don't perform very well, there'll be less corporate tax being paid. But also in a negative output gap, you're also going to be expecting that people will need more welfare support from the government. So what we'd expect to see is that more people will claim unemployment benefits. Now, when you think about it, we call these automatic stabilisers because what these changes in government spending and taxation do, they help tackle some of the extreme impacts of booms and busts on the business cycle. So in a boom, for example, we know we've got high inflation, we've got to bring down aggregate demand. Well, that reduction in government spending and that growth in taxes would have the impact of helping those demand pull inflationary pressures in the economy. What we know is in a negative output gap situation, we've got to raise aggregate demand. While this automatic increase in government spending and reduction in taxes will help bring the economy back towards trend rates of growth, with the key reason being that government spending is an injection and taxation is a withdrawal. So in a boom, automatically, government spending will fall and taxation will increase to ease the size of that positive output gap. And in a negative output gap, taxation will automatically fall and government spending will increase to help ease the size of that negative output gap situation. So you've got there, everyone, automatic stabilizers. Right, some more key terms. You've got here something we call discretionary fiscal policies. Now, this is when these positive and negative output gaps are that extreme that automatic stabilizers are not sufficient to tackle problems in the economy. So a good example could be in the financial crash of 2007-2008, we couldn't just rely on automatic stabilizers. Those extra benefits being paid out and that little bit of reduction in taxes because firms were struggling wasn't deemed sufficient to help ease the size of the recession. So what we had to do was to create additional policies that could be used to help tackle the worst extremes of that recession. So, for example, the government brought out the Help to Buy scheme to help prop up the housing market. They also brought in something called the car scrappage scheme, which was designed to encourage more people to buy new cars. But we also had a temporary reduction in VAT to give the economy an additional boost. So, guys, the idea is that sometimes the size of booms and busts on the business cycle are too extreme for automatic stabilizers to fix the problem. So in those examples there, you would bring in these discretionary fiscal policies. These would be brought in to fix the problems, and then once the problems are fixed, you would end these policies. Sometimes, though, there is a problem with these policies, is that there is a time lag, and that is because these policies have to be approved by Parliament. So, for example, you might be in a recession, so you think, right, let's give the car industry a boost by bringing in the car scrappage scheme. Let's give the housing market a boost by bringing in the Help to Buy scheme. Well, these policies need to be scrutinised by MPs, they need to be passed and then brought into legislation. So you might find that the benefits of these will have a time lag. So they won't impact on the recession straight away, whereas automatic stabilisers will impact straight away on the economy. The next one is something called a cyclical deficit. Now, what we would expect is that when we're in a negative output gap, we will automatically run a budget deficit, with the reason being the economy needs a bit of a boost. So government spending will increase, taxation will fall, and that makes budget deficits more likely. But then what you would expect is that when you're in a positive output gap on the business cycle, government spending will start to fall, taxation will grow, and budget surpluses would start to happen. So think about what we're saying here, cyclical deficits. When you're in a negative output gap on the business cycle, you would argue we should be running with budget deficits. But then during positive output gaps, it should be budget surpluses. And what that should be is sustainable. Because what that will mean is debt built up in a negative output gap will then be repaid in a positive output gap situation. And this should mean that in the long run, we shouldn't be building up any national debt. So it's seen as a sustainable way of borrowing. Budget deficits will help tackle a negative output gap, but then we pay that back off in a positive output gap. Now, unfortunately, in the UK economy, we have been running in recent years with a structural budget deficit. Now, what this is saying is we are running budget deficits in both positive and negative output gaps. So in a negative output gap, you would argue, yeah, fair enough, run a budget deficit to help the economy recover. But then when we're in recovery, we're still operating with budget deficits. We get to the next recession, we're building up another budget deficit, even bigger. We get into the positive output gap and we are still building up budget deficits. Now, this is seen as really unsustainable because what it will see is over time, national debt will only get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. Right, anyway, what I would now like you to do is to take stock of what we've just done. So I want you to copy down these 4 questions, hit pause, put down your answers, and when you are comfortable with your answers, hit play and watch the rest of the video, please. So hit pause now, please. And when you've got your answers down, please hit play. Right, everyone, welcome back. Now, what we've got here are factors that would influence the size of fiscal deficits. So these are the things which would influence how big budget deficits are across the economy. Now, the first one is obvious, really, the state of the economy. What we would expect is that fiscal deficits will be bigger in negative output gaps. And that is because of the need for automatic stabilisers, so more transfer payments to be paid out to people, and that reduction in tax revenue due to more people being unemployed. But on top of that, there might be more need for discretionary fiscal policies to give the economy a further boost to move it back into trend rate growth. Now, clearly what you would expect then would be that in a positive output gap, fiscal deficits should be really, really small. In reality, they should really be fiscal surpluses. The next one, political priorities. Now, you might argue, for example, that certain governments might want to improve infrastructure. They might want to tackle inequality. And those policies might need bigger fiscal deficits in order to achieve those political priorities. So, for example, if you want to reduce inequality, what you might be looking to is to increase welfare spending to people. You might want to improve access to education and healthcare, and they would need lots of additional government spending. You could argue a political priority right now is to tackle the impacts of COVID-19. Well, that requires lots and lots of additional government spending to help people get through the worst of COVID-19. Next one, demographic factors. Well, if you've got, for example, an aging population, you're going to have a lot of people in retirement. Well, that would probably mean that you're going to be running fiscal deficit because those people will claim transfer payments, so old age pensions, but they're also not going to be contributing taxes because they're no longer working. So they will not be paying any income tax, for example. You could even argue that if you've got a very young population with lots of children, that would mean that you're going to be running fiscal deficit because those people will be going to school, which requires lots of current expenditure, but again, they'll not be contributing income taxes. So with demographic factors, you might be looking at the size of the dependent population, so the proportion of your population that are not working in the economy. If you've got lots of people who are children or retired or economically inactive, that would mean that tax revenue could be quite low, and that could lead to a growing fiscal deficit. The next one, sales of state-owned assets. And now, if we've got lots of nationalised or state-controlled industries, if these things are sold off, that will generate lots of revenue for the government, and that would reduce fiscal deficits. So that could be a good way of tackling how big a fiscal deficit is. The next two I'm going to lump together, how efficient the tax system is, how much tax avoidance and evasion takes place. If we've got a system where it's very difficult to actually get hold of people's tax money, or if people are finding really, really clever ways of avoiding or evading paying their tax, then that would mean that the tax revenue will be lower for the government, and that would clearly increase the size of fiscal deficits. Now, the next one, interest payments on debt. Now, what you would argue is if the yield or the interest on bonds are very, very low, that would encourage the government to increase budget deficits because the opportunity cost of borrowing all that money would be quite low. If the interest payments are quite high, that would incentivize the government to reduce fiscal deficits because the cost of that extra borrowing will become really, really high. Another one is the performance of the housing market. If the housing market is performing well, that would generally signal that the economy is performing well. Lots of consumption, lots of spending, and that should mean that we shouldn't be operating with fiscal deficits. If the housing market is struggling, that probably signals that we're in some kind of negative output gap, and that would mean that fiscal deficits might have to increase. Right, moving on then, everyone. What I would now like to think about is question 2, and I've put here explain 3 potential causes of a persistent budget deficit within the UK economy. What we know is the UK has been operating with a budget deficit now for a long time. Now, you could argue this has partly been because of recessions such as COVID-19 and the financial crash, but even during periods of economic growth, the UK has been operating with budget deficits. Try and put down for me 3 different potential reasons why you think the UK has got this problem. So hit pause now, please put down your answers, and when you're happy, hit play, and we'll carry on with the rest of the video. Right, now what we're going to be doing now in the last part of this video is looking at the implications of national debt. Now, what we know is the UK has got roughly a national debt of 100% of GDP. Well, these are all those combined fiscal deficits that have been yet to be repaid. Now, this is a big problem that we've got in our economy. Now, one of the biggest problems is that it can lead to higher interest rates. Now, that can then crowd out private investment. Now, let me explain why. If the government want to borrow lots of money, they have to create lots of additional government. Now, if they're supplying more bonds to entice people to buy all them additional bonds, they've got to be offering people higher returns on those investments. And what this will do, it would have the impact of pushing up the yield on government bonds. And all that in effect means that the interest rate on government bonds is now higher. Now, that will make lending to the government more attractive. Now, if that's the case, that will then crowd out private investment. If the government have got all the currency available in the economy, it will make it more difficult for private businesses to go to banks to borrow, because all that money in the banks has been lent to the government instead. And it would have the impact of raising the interest rates that businesses pay when they borrow money. So that will stop the growth of the private sector. It makes it more difficult for businesses to grow. But we do have to be a little bit careful though. Here's some evaluation for that point. It really, really does depend. So for example, it depends on how big that borrowing is as a proportion of GDP. Now in the UK, we know at the moment that borrowing is a big proportion of GDP, which means the risk of the crowding out argument is pretty significant. Next one, you can argue that some of the problems of this can be reduced by the use of quantitative easing. So think about what we're doing here. If the central bank creates money and then use that money to buy up lots and lots of government bonds, it means that all the investment that other banks are now making is not in government bonds, and it becomes more available for normal households and businesses to borrow. So that might reduce that problem of the crowding out argument. Finally, as well on here, borrowing may be made internationally. So if all your government debt is being held by people outside of your economy, it still means there should be good access to credit for businesses within your economy. Now, another problem of high national debt is debt servicing. Now, what we know then is if we have got lots of debt as a country, over 100% of GDP, the people that have bought those government bonds are doing so because they expect to be paid an interest. And that means at the moment, our government is paying over £50 billion a year on servicing that debt. That's not paying off the debt, that's paying off the interest repayments on that debt. And that is a heck of a lot of money that carries big opportunity costs. All those interest repayments could have been used to build new hospitals, build new roads, upgrade budgets for healthcare and education to raise economic development, but we can't because that money is instead paying off interest on debt. But that means tax revenue that you pay is not all going on benefiting us as people. It's not going on current capital and transfer payments, it's going off and paying the interest on debt instead. Next problem, intergenerational equity problems. Well, the idea today is that when we borrow today, for example, to fund transfer payments and current expenditure, we're benefiting from that money today, but then we're expecting our kids and our kids' kids, our future generations, to pay off that debt on our behalf. Well, that means that their tax money in the future is not going on benefiting them, it's paying off debt that we built up today. So what we're doing is we are indirectly lowering living standards of. So when we borrow today, what we're doing is we are reducing the spending power of future generations. Well, that would lower their economic welfare. What we're doing to be a little bit careful of, though, is if we borrow today, due to inflation, the real value of that debt will actually fall. Okay, think about why. You know, as economies grow and as incomes increase, how much we borrow in real terms will become less significant over time. Okay, so a good example I've put down there, a £10,000 debt today is higher in real terms today than it will be in 20 years, because in 20 years, wage rates will grow. So in theory, if economies keep on growing, then the significance of that debt will actually start to fall. Finally, credit agencies, so credit ratings. Now, the idea is every economy's government will be given a credit rating, which will assess how safe investing in that economy is. Now, if you've got really, really high national debt, that would reduce the credit rating of our economy. Now, what that can technically then do is to push up interest rates, because it means that your economy is now more risky than what it used to be. That could again lead to crowding. It also means that to borrow, and if we do, we've got to pay higher interest rates, but it also means governments have got to pay higher interest rates to borrow in the future as well. Right, guys, now next slide. We mentioned earlier on about structural budget deficits. So what we said was, again, that a structural budget deficit is when we operate with a budget deficit, not just in negative, but also in positive output gap situations. Now, these are some of the big implications of this for an economy. We mentioned before, you lose your credit rating. Economies that have got good credit ratings get AAA credit rating status. And if you've got that, that often means that you can borrow at really, really low interest rates because you're low risk. So if you've got a persistent and growing structural budget deficit, it means that national debt is going to keep on increasing. And that will mean investors across the world view your economy as higher risk. So therefore, to lend to you, they now expect higher interest rates. And that would also increase repayment costs on national debt. So you've got all those early problems of opportunity costs, tax money going on debt rather than people. You've got the crowding out argument. High levels of national debt will push up interest rates, which makes it more difficult for people to borrow. That could stop the private sector from growing. But we do have to be aware that it can create the crowding in argument as well. If these big deficits going on upgrading infrastructure and human capital, that could promote the growth of businesses as well. We've also got to be aware that big budget deficits is inflationary. If government spending, which is an injection, exceeds taxes, which are withdrawal, then the government are injecting more money into the economy. That could be inflationary. We mentioned before about the loss of credit ratings. If that happens, it could deter foreign direct investment because people view your economy as more risky. But also what it will mean is long term that something has got to be done about this. And that would lead to the likelihood of fiscal austerity. Okay, so to lower these structural budget deficits, at some point in the future, you've got to rein in government spending. You may need to raise taxes. And that could mean in the future, we're going to have this intergenerational equity problem. Living standards will start to repay some of these different debts. Right, everyone, just to end this video, I want you to think about this one now. Identify and explain 4 potential problems of high national debt. So try and put these things down, explain what they are. So hit pause now, put down your answer. And when you've answered that question, you will finish with this video. Thank you very much.